Thomas McKinnon stood at the kitchen window of his small ranch house, watching his older brothers Jake and Samuel work the main herd in the distance. Even from half a mile away, he could see their strong shoulders moving in perfect rhythm as they guided the cattle toward the water. His left arm, shorter and weaker than his right since birth, hung uselessly at his side as he gripped his coffee cup with his good hand. At 28 years old, Thomas had long accepted that he would never be like his brothers. Where they were, tall and broad-shouldered, he was lean and careful in his movements. Where they could rope a calf with one hand and brand it with the other, Thomas had to think through every task twice, finding ways to work around what others did naturally. The McKinnon Ranch had been their father's pride for 30 years. Old William McKinnon had built it from nothing, starting with a small patch of land and a handful of cattle. By the time he died last winter, the ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of Montana grassland. William had always said the land would be divided equally among his 3 sons, but when the lawyer read the will, Thomas got the surprise of his life. His portion was the smallest piece, tucked away in the northeastern corner where the land was rockier and the grass thinner. It came with an old cabin, a small barn, and about 200 head of cattle. Jake and Samuel had gotten the main house, the best grazing land, and the majority of the herd. They'd tried to be kind about it, telling Thomas that father had known he'd be happier with something more manageable. But Thomas knew the real reason. His disability made him less capable in their father's eyes, even though he'd worked just as hard as his brothers his whole life. He'd learned to compensate for his weak arm by being smarter, more careful, more patient. But none of that seemed to matter when it came to inheritance. The worst part wasn't the smaller portion of land. The worst part was the loneliness that came with it. Jake had married Beth 3 years ago, and their first baby was due any day. Samuel had been courting Lucy Patterson for 2 years, and everyone expected a wedding announcement soon. Both women were local girls who'd grown up knowing the McKinnon, boys accepting Thomas's difference as just part of who he was. But finding a wife as an adult man was different. Thomas had tried the traditional route first. He'd attended every church social, every town dance, every harvest festival for years. The young women were polite enough, but he could see the way. Their eyes would dart to his arm, then quickly look away. He could sense their discomfort, their uncertainty about whether he could provide for a family. After years of rejection, Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife and the town's unofficial matchmaker, had suggested he try advertising for a mail-order bride. "There are plenty of women back east looking for good men," she'd said kindly. "Women who value character over appearances." Thomas had been skeptical, but desperation made him try. He'd placed his first advertisement in a Chicago newspaper 2 years ago. The ad was simple and honest. Montana rancher 26 seeks virtuous woman for marriage. Own land and cattle. Serious inquiries only. The first woman who responded was Catherine Mills from Illinois. Her letters were sweet and hopeful, full of dreams about life on a ranch. They corresponded for 3 months, and Thomas began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd found someone who could see past his physical limitations. He'd told her about his arm in his 4th letter, explaining that he'd been born with it shorter and weaker, but that it didn't stop him from running his ranch successfully. Catherine's next letter was her last. She wrote that she'd given his situation much thought and prayer, but felt that frontier life required a man of full physical capability. She was sorry, but she couldn't move forward with their arrangement. The second woman, Helen Cooper from Ohio, lasted even shorter. She seemed more interested in the size of his ranch and his financial prospects than in getting to know him as a person. When he mentioned his disability, she didn't even bother to write back. The third rejection hurt the most. Mary Elizabeth Thompson from Pennsylvania had seemed different. Her letters were thoughtful and kind. She asked about his daily life, his hopes for the future, his relationship with his brothers. For 6 months, they'd built what Thomas thought was a genuine connection through their correspondence. When he finally told her about his arm, she wrote back with what seemed like understanding. She said physical differences didn't matter to her, that she was more interested in a man's heart and character. Thomas had been so encouraged that he'd sent money for her train ticket to Montana. Mary Elizabeth never got on the train. 3 days before her scheduled departure, Thomas received a telegram. Cannot proceed with arrangement, returning funds. Wish you well. Later, through Mrs. Patterson's connections, Thomas learned the truth. Mary Elizabeth had been corresponding with 2 other men at the same time. When she had to choose, she'd picked the one who offered the most security and the fewest complications. That had been 8 months ago, and Thomas hadn't tried again since. The rejections had worn him down, made him question everything about himself. He'd thrown himself into working his small ranch, proving to himself, if not to anyone else, that he was capable of building something worthwhile. His days started before dawn and ended well after sunset. He'd learned to rope with his right arm while using his left to guide his horse. He'd figured out how to repair fences by bracing posts with his body, while hammering with his good hand. Every task took him longer than it would take his brothers, but he got it done. The cattle on his land were thriving. His small herd was some of the healthiest in the county because he paid attention to details others missed. He knew each animal individually, could spot sickness or injury from across a field. His beef brought top prices at market because he was careful and thorough in ways that his brothers, blessed with natural strength, didn't need to be. But success in ranching didn't cure loneliness. Thomas came home every night to an empty house, cooked simple meals for one, and spent his evenings reading by lamplight. He'd accumulated quite a library over the years, books on cattle breeding, veterinary care, agriculture, and history. Reading helped pass the time and made him feel less isolated from the wider world. The silence in his house was broken only by the ticking of his father's old clock and the occasional howl of coyotes in the distance. Sometimes he'd catch himself, talking to his horse or his cattle just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. His brothers invited him for Sunday dinners, and he usually went. But watching Jake and Beth together, seeing how they completed each other's sentences and shared private jokes, only reminded Thomas of what he was missing. Soon there would be a baby, and he'd be Uncle Thomas, the bachelor brother who lived alone on his little piece of land. Mrs. Patterson had been after him again lately, to try advertising for another bride. She'd heard of success stories from other towns, women who'd traveled west and found happiness with men they'd never met. But Thomas couldn't face another rejection. Each one had chipped away at his confidence until he'd started to believe what the rejections implied. That he wasn't enough. That no woman would choose a life with him when better options existed. On this particular morning, as he watched his brothers work the herd with easy competence, Thomas made a decision. He would stop hoping for something that wasn't meant to be. He would focus on building his ranch, maybe hiring some help when he could afford it. He would be the bachelor uncle, the reliable neighbor, the man who was always willing to lend a hand but never expected anything in return. He turned away from the window and began preparing for another day of work. There were fences to mend in the south pasture, and 2 of his best breeding cows looked ready to drop their calves any day. The work would keep his hands busy and his mind occupied, which was about all he could ask for these days. As he pulled on his worn leather gloves, carefully fitting the left one over his weaker hand, Thomas didn't know that 3 states away, a woman named Margaret O'Brien was facing her own desperate situation. He didn't know that sometimes the most unlikely connections happen when 2 people have given up on hope entirely. He didn't know that his quiet, steady life was about to change forever, or that his greatest perceived weakness would become the very thing that made him perfect for someone who needed gentleness more than strength, understanding more than passion, and partnership more than romance. For now, Thomas McKinnon was just a lonely rancher heading out to tend his cattle, convinced that he would spend the rest of his life alone, never knowing that the woman who would change everything was already writing the letter that would bring them together. Margaret O'Brien sat on the front steps of what used to be her home, holding the eviction notice with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the sheriff delivered it an hour ago. The paper felt heavier than it should, like it was made of lead, instead of ordinary writing paper. In neat official handwriting, it told her she had 30 days to vacate the property, 30 days to find somewhere else to live with 2 young children, and $3 to her name. Behind her, through the thin walls of the small farmhouse, she could hear 8-year-old Lucy and 5-year-old Ben playing quietly with their few remaining toys. They'd learned to be quiet over the past months, sensing their mother's stress even when she tried to hide it. Children had a way of knowing when the adults in their lives were barely holding things together. Margaret folded the notice and slipped it into her apron pocket, where it joined the other pieces of paper that had arrived with increasing frequency since Patrick's death 6 months ago. Bills from the doctor who'd tried to save her husband from the tuberculosis that ravaged his lungs. Bills from the pharmacy for medicines that hadn't worked. Bills from the funeral home for a service she couldn't afford, but couldn't deny him. Patrick. O'Brien had been a good man in many ways, but he'd never been practical about money. He'd believed that hard work alone would solve any problem, that if he just put in longer hours on their small farm, prosperity would eventually follow. What he hadn't counted on was getting sick just as their crops were ready for harvest 2 seasons ago. Margaret had tried to manage the farm work while nursing Patrick through his illness, but there was only so much one woman could do. Their neighbor, Mr. Henderson, had helped when he could, but he had his own family and farm to worry about. By the time Patrick died, they'd lost most of their livestock. Half their crop had rotted in the field, and the debts had piled up like snow in a blizzard. She'd tried to keep going after the funeral. She'd planted a kitchen garden and sold vegetables in town. She'd taken in washing and mending for other families. She'd even tried to continue Patrick's work, but farming required strength and equipment she didn't have. The plow horse had to be sold to pay for food. The good tools went to cover the doctor's bill. One by one, everything they'd built together had been stripped away. Margaret had watched their life disappear piece by piece, always believing she could find a way to save it if she just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, prayed hard enough. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try, it isn't enough. The final blow had come last week when Mr. Jameson from the bank had visited. He'd been apologetic but firm. The farm was being sold to cover the remaining debts. The new owners wanted possession by the end of the month. Margaret and the children would have to find somewhere else to go. But where? Margaret had grown up in an orphanage in Kansas City. She had no family to turn to, no relatives who might take in a widow with 2 children. Patrick's family lived back in Ireland, and even if she could afford passage across the ocean, she'd never met them and had no idea if they'd welcome her. She'd asked around town about work, but the answers were always the same. The hotel might need cleaning help, but they couldn't pay enough to support a family, and they certainly couldn't provide housing. The general store needed someone part-time, but again, the wages wouldn't cover rent and food for 3 people. The school already had a teacher, and besides, Margaret's education had ended at 14 when the orphanage found her a position as a housemaid. The hardest part was watching her children try to understand what was happening to their world. Lucy, who'd always been serious for her age, had become the little mother, helping Ben with his clothes and trying to comfort him when he cried for his papa. Ben, who'd been full of energy and laughter before Patrick's illness, had grown quiet and clingy, rarely leaving Margaret's side. They'd already lost their father. Now they were going to lose their home, their security, everything familiar. Margaret lay awake at night wondering what kind of mother she was, unable to protect her children from forces beyond her control. She'd considered every option she could think of. She'd heard of women who worked in factories in the big cities, but that would mean leaving Lucy and Ben in an orphanage or with strangers while she worked. She couldn't bear the thought of separating their family when they'd already lost so much. Some of the church ladies had suggested she might find work as a live-in housekeeper for a wealthy family, but again, most such positions wouldn't allow her to keep her children with her. The few that might consider it wanted someone without the complications of a family. That morning, after a sleepless night of worry, Margaret had walked into town with her last dollar to buy a newspaper. She'd heard other women talking about the mail-order bride advertisements, though she'd never imagined she'd be desperate enough to consider such a thing. The idea of marrying a stranger terrified her. Her marriage to Patrick had been arranged by the orphanage when she turned 18, but at least she'd known him for several months before the wedding. He'd been a regular visitor to the orphanage, helping with repairs and odd jobs. She'd watched him interact with the children, seen his kindness and patience. When the matron suggested the match, it had seemed reasonable, even promising. Their marriage hadn't been a love story, but it had been a partnership. Patrick had been gentle with her, patient as she learned to manage a household. He'd been delighted when Lucy was born, and absolutely devoted to Ben. He'd worked hard to provide for them, even if he wasn't always practical about how to go about it. But Patrick had also been moody, especially after long days of frustrating work. He'd drink sometimes, not enough to be mean, but enough to become distant and unreachable. There had been nights when Margaret felt more like his housekeeper than his wife, caring for his needs without receiving much emotional connection in return. Still, she'd been grateful for the security of marriage, the protection of his name, the sense of belonging somewhere. The thought of starting over with a complete stranger in an unknown place felt overwhelming. But what choice did she have? Margaret spread the newspaper on her lap and began reading through the advertisements with clinical attention. Most of the men seemed to want young, attractive women without encumbrances. They wrote about needing someone to cook and clean, to bear children and provide companionship. Few mentioned anything about accepting existing children. Some of the ads made Margaret uncomfortable with their emphasis on physical appearance or their demanding tone. Others seemed too good to be true, promising wealth and luxury that made her suspicious. She'd learned through hard experience that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. Then she saw an advertisement that was different from the others. It was simple, almost plain in its straightforwardness. Montana. Rancher seeks practical woman for companionate marriage. Children welcome, no dowry required, physical appearance unimportant. Margaret read it 3 times, looking for hidden meanings or demands she might have missed. The man, Thomas McKinnon, wasn't promising romance or passion. He wasn't claiming to be wealthy or particularly handsome. He was looking for practicality, and he welcomed children. He didn't require a dowry, which was good since she had nothing to offer but herself and her willingness to work hard. The phrase, physical appearance unimportant, caught her attention too. Margaret had never considered herself beautiful, even in her youth. Now at 26, worn down by grief and hardship, she knew she looked older than her years. Her hands were rough from work, her face thin from worry and poor eating. Most men seemed to want wives who would be ornamental as well as useful, but Thomas McKinnon seemed to be looking for something different. A partner, not a decoration. Someone practical who could work alongside him, not someone who needed to be protected and pampered. Margaret walked home slowly, the newspaper tucked under her arm, thinking about the decision ahead of her. By the time she reached the farmhouse, Lucy and Ben were outside, picking the last of the vegetables from their small garden. They looked so young and vulnerable, depending on her to somehow make everything all right. That evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen. She'd decided to write to Thomas McKinnon, but she wasn't sure how to begin. How do you introduce yourself to a stranger who might become your husband? How do you explain your situation without sounding pathetic or desperate, even though you are both? She started and stopped several times, crumpling up false starts and beginning again. Finally, she decided that honesty was the only approach that made sense. If Thomas McKinnon was going to accept her and her children, he needed to know exactly what he was getting. Dear Mr. McKinnon, she wrote, I am writing in response to your advertisement in the Kansas City Herald. I am a widow with 2 children, ages 8 and 5. My husband died 6 months ago, and I find myself in desperate circumstances. We are about to lose our home, and I have no family to turn to. I am not writing to you from choice, but from necessity, and I thought you should know that from the beginning. The letter went on to describe her situation honestly but without self-pity. She told him about Lucy and Ben, about her limited education but willingness to learn, about her experience managing a household, and Thomas McKinnon stared at the letter in his hands, reading it for the 3rd time that morning. When Mrs. Patterson had brought it over from the post office, he'd almost thrown it away unopened. After his previous experiences with mail-order bride correspondence, he'd sworn off the whole idea. But something about this letter was different from the moment he broke the wax seal. Margaret O'Brien's handwriting was neat, but simple, the writing of someone who'd had basic schooling but hadn't spent years perfecting fancy penmanship. More importantly, her words were unlike anything he'd received before. Instead of flowery promises or demands about his financial situation, she'd written with stark, almost brutal honesty about her circumstances. "I am not writing to you from choice but from necessity," she'd said. And Thomas found himself respecting that honesty more than all the sweet words from previous correspondence combined. Here was a woman who didn't pretend her situation was anything other than desperate, who didn't try to make herself sound more appealing than she was. She had children. 2 of them. Thomas had never considered that before, but as he read about 8-year-old Lucy and 5-year-old Ben, he found himself curious rather than concerned. He'd always been good with children, patient in ways that his more energetic brothers weren't. When Jake and Beth brought their baby to family dinners, Thomas was often the one who could calm a fussy infant or coax a smile from a cranky toddler. What struck him most was the tone of Margaret's letter. She wasn't begging, despite her desperate situation. She was offering a business proposition, a partnership based on mutual need rather than romantic fantasy. She promised to work hard, to be practical, to help build something meaningful. She asked for nothing but a chance. Thomas spent the rest of that day thinking about the letter, carrying it with him as he worked. By evening, he'd made his decision. He would write back, not with false promises or romantic declarations, but with the same honesty Margaret had shown him. His response was careful and thoughtful. He described his ranch honestly. The size, the challenges, the remote location. He told her about his daily routine, the harsh Montana winters, the nearest town being 15 miles away. He wanted her to understand exactly what kind of life she'd be choosing if she came west, but he also told her about his disability. Thomas had learned from his previous failures that it was better to be upfront about his limitations than to let someone build expectations he couldn't meet. He explained that his left arm was weaker and shorter than his right, that he had to find creative ways to do some tasks, but that he'd been successfully running his ranch for years. "I won't pretend to be something I'm not," he wrote. "I'm not the strongest man or the most handsome. I can't offer you luxury or an easy life, but I can offer you honesty, stability, and a partner who will respect your contribution to whatever we might build together." Margaret's second letter arrived 2 weeks later, and Thomas was surprised by his own anticipation as he opened it. She thanked him for his honesty about his physical situation and wrote something that made him sit down hard in his kitchen chair. "My late husband often said that a man's worth isn't in the strength of his arms, but in the steadiness of his character. Your letter shows me a steady man, Mr. McKinnon." She went on to describe her children in more detail, and Thomas found himself smiling as he read. Lucy sounded like a serious, responsible child who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. Ben seemed to be the dreamer, the one who still believed in magic despite the hardships his family had faced. Margaret wrote about them with such love and protectiveness that Thomas could practically see her fierce determination to give them a better life. Their correspondence developed a rhythm over the following months. Thomas would write once a week, usually on Sunday evenings after he'd finished his ranch work and had time to think carefully about what he wanted to say. Margaret would respond within days, her letters arriving with a regularity that Thomas began to count on. Gradually, their letters became less formal, more personal. Margaret told him about her childhood in the orphanage, about learning to be self-reliant from a young age. She described her first marriage with careful neutrality, making it clear that while she'd cared for Patrick, their relationship had been more about survival and partnership than romance. Thomas found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone. He wrote about growing up in his brother's shadows, about the loneliness of his current life, about his dreams of building something lasting on his small piece of land. He told her about his books, his interest in improving cattle breeding techniques, his plans to eventually expand his herd. As winter settled over both Kansas and Montana, their letters became longer and more frequent. Margaret wrote about the challenges of keeping her children warm in their increasingly run-down farmhouse, about her efforts to stretch their dwindling supplies until spring. Thomas wrote about the harsh Montana weather, about the satisfaction of successfully bringing his cattle through difficult conditions. One letter from Margaret particularly touched Thomas. She described the evening when Ben had asked why they had to leave their house, and Lucy had tried to explain about money and debts with the seriousness of a child forced to understand adult problems too early. I realized, Margaret wrote, that my children have already lost so much. Their father, their security, their sense that the world is a safe and predictable place. I don't want them to lose hope too. When I think about coming to Montana, about starting over with you, what I hope for most is the chance to give them a childhood again. A place where they can be children instead of worrying about whether there will be enough food tomorrow. Thomas's response was immediate and decisive. Send me your exact situation with the debts and the farm, he wrote. I have some money saved, and if we're going to be partners, we might as well start now. Margaret's next letter showed a vulnerability she hadn't revealed before. She was overwhelmed by his offer to help, but also frightened by the implications. I don't want you to think I'm only interested in what you can provide financially, she wrote. I want to be clear that I'm prepared to work for whatever life we build together. I don't want to be a burden or a charity case. Thomas appreciated her pride, but he also recognized practical necessity when he saw it. His next letter was firm but kind. Partners help each other, Margaret. That's what partnership means. You're not asking me to rescue you. You're offering to work alongside me to build something better than either of us could manage alone. Let me help with the immediate crisis so we can focus on the future. As spring approached, their correspondence had evolved from desperate strangers exchanging basic information to two people genuinely getting to know each other. Thomas found himself looking forward to Margaret's letters with an anticipation that surprised him. Her dry sense of humor came through in her descriptions of small-town life. Her thoughtful questions about ranch management showed a practical intelligence that impressed him, and her obvious devotion to her children touched something in him he hadn't known existed. Margaret, for her part, had begun to see Thomas as more than just an escape from her desperate situation. His letters revealed a man of deep thoughtfulness, someone who considered problems from multiple angles before acting. He wrote about his cattle with genuine affection, described his books with intellectual curiosity, and discussed his plans for the future with a quiet confidence that was reassuring rather than boastful. The turning point in their correspondence came in early April, when Thomas received a letter that was different from all the others. Margaret had written it late at night after the children were asleep, and her words carried an emotional weight that her previous letters had avoided. I want to be honest with you about something, Thomas, she wrote. I'm frightened about coming to Montana, about marrying someone I've never met, about uprooting my children from everything they've known, but I'm more frightened about staying here and watching us sink deeper into poverty and desperation. You've shown me more kindness and consideration in your letters than I've known in years. You've made me believe that there might be a different kind of life possible, one built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than just survival. I want to try to build that life with you, if you're still willing. Thomas's response was written the same day he received her letter. Send me the details about train tickets to Montana, he wrote. It's time for us to stop being strangers and start being partners. When Margaret received the money for train tickets along with detailed instructions about the journey west, she sat at her kitchen table with tears running down her face. Not tears of sadness, but of relief mixed with terror, mixed with something that might have been hope. She had no idea what Thomas McKinnon would be like in person, whether their carefully built correspondence would translate into a workable relationship in real life. She didn't know if her children would accept this quiet rancher who spoke of partnership rather than passion. She couldn't predict whether she'd be able to adapt to life on a remote Montana ranch after growing up in Kansas towns. But she knew that Thomas had treated her with more respect and consideration as a pen pal than many men showed their wives. She knew that he'd offered her and her children not just survival, but the chance to build something. Margaret O'Brien stepped off the train in Billings, Montana, with Lucy clinging to her skirt and 5-year-old Ben hiding behind her back. The platform was dusty and loud, filled with travelers and workers shouting over the noise of the steam engine. After 3 days of traveling, they were exhausted, grimy and overwhelmed by the vastness of the landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. Margaret scanned the crowd, looking for Thomas McKinnon among the men waiting by the platform. She realized with a start that she had no idea what he looked like. In all their months of correspondence, neither had thought to exchange photographs. She knew he was 28, that he had brown hair and that his left arm was shorter than his right, but beyond that, he could be any of the dozen men standing nearby. Then she saw him. There was something about the way he stood slightly apart from the others, his hat held carefully in his right hand, that made her certain. He was scanning the passengers with the same searching look she must have had, and when their eyes met across the platform, they both knew immediately. Thomas was neither handsome nor plain, but somewhere in between, with kind eyes and a face that looked honest and reliable. His left arm was indeed shorter, hanging at his side in a way that seemed natural rather than awkward. He wore clean but practical clothes, a simple shirt, worn pants, and boots that had seen plenty of work. "Mrs. O'Brien?" he asked as he approached, his voice carrying the slight hesitation of someone meeting a stranger who might become much more. "Mr. McKinnon," she replied with a small nod. "And these are Lucy and Ben." Lucy stepped forward with the grave politeness of a child who'd been carefully coached. "Hello, Mr. McKinnon. Mama says you have a ranch with real cattle." Ben remained firmly attached to Margaret's skirt, peeking out just enough to get a look at this man who was supposed to become their new father. Thomas knelt down to Lucy's level, careful not to make sudden movements that might frighten Ben further. "I do have cattle," he said seriously, "and horses and chickens, and a barn cat named Smokey who thinks he owns the whole place. Would you like to meet them?" Lucy nodded solemnly, and Ben whispered something to Margaret. She smiled for the first time since stepping off the train. "Ben wants to know if the horses are very big." "Some are," Thomas said, addressing Ben directly. "But I have one mare named Daisy who's very gentle. She likes children, and I thought you might like to learn to ride her when you're ready." The wagon ride to the ranch took 2 hours through country that seemed to go on forever. Margaret had known Montana would be different from Kansas, but she hadn't prepared herself for the sheer scale of it. The sky stretched from horizon to horizon without a tree or building to break the endless expanse. It was beautiful in a way that made her feel very small. Thomas proved to be a thoughtful guide, pointing out landmarks and explaining the country they were passing through. He showed them where his land began, the boundaries marked by fence posts and natural features like rock formations and creek beds. His ranch house sat in a valley between low hills, protected from the worst of the winter winds. The house itself was modest but sturdy, built of logs with a stone foundation. It was larger than the farmhouse Margaret had lost, with 3 bedrooms, a main room that served as kitchen and living area, and a covered porch that faced east toward the sunrise. Behind the house stood a barn, several outbuildings and corrals, where horses looked up curiously at their arrival. "It's not fancy," Thomas said as he helped Margaret down from the wagon, "but it's solid and warm. I built most of it myself over the past 5 years." Margaret walked through the house slowly, taking in details. The furniture was simple but well made. The kitchen had a good stove and plenty of shelving. The windows were clean and let in lots of light. Everything was neat and organized in the way of someone who lived alone and had learned to keep things orderly out of necessity. Lucy and Ben explored with the cautious excitement of children in a new place. Ben was delighted to discover that one of the bedrooms was clearly intended for him, with a small bed and a window that looked out toward the barn. Lucy's room had been prepared with equal care, complete with a rag rug and curtains that Margaret realized Thomas must have made himself. That first evening was awkward for everyone. Thomas cooked dinner, a simple but filling meal of beef stew and fresh bread. Margaret offered to help, but the kitchen was organized for one person, and they kept getting in each other's way. Lucy ate quietly, watching Thomas with careful attention. Ben was still shy, speaking only in whispers to his mother. After dinner, Thomas showed them around the immediate area. He introduced them to the animals, and Margaret was touched by the gentle way he handled her children's nervousness. He let them feed carrots to the horses, showed them where the chickens nested, and explained how everything worked without making it sound overwhelming. When bedtime came, both children wanted Margaret to stay in their rooms until they fell asleep. In this strange new place with a strange new man who was supposed to become their stepfather, they needed extra reassurance that she wasn't going anywhere. Thomas seemed to understand. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "I'll be on the porch if you need anything." The first few weeks tested everyone's patience and adaptability. Margaret had to learn Thomas's routines and figure out how to fit her own work around his schedule. The kitchen stove behaved differently than she was used to. The water had to be carried from a well instead of coming from a hand pump by the sink. Even simple tasks like doing laundry required learning new methods and systems. Lucy and Ben struggled with the adjustment too. Everything was different. The sounds at night, the smells of the ranch, the vast emptiness that surrounded them on all sides. Lucy tried to be brave and helpful, but Margaret could see the strain in her daughter's careful composure. Ben had nightmares and cried for his papa, confused about why they were here and whether they were staying forever. Thomas was patient with all of them, but Margaret could sense his own adjustment difficulties. He'd lived alone for years, used to complete quiet and the freedom to move through his house without considering anyone else's needs. Suddenly, his home was full of voices, questions, and the constant activity that comes with children. The breakthrough began with small things. Margaret noticed that Thomas's shirts were well mended but showing their age, and she quietly began sewing him new ones from fabric she found in town. Thomas observed that Margaret struggled with the heavy water buckets and installed a pulley system that made the task easier for her. Lucy discovered that Thomas had a remarkable collection of books, many of them beyond her current reading level, but filled with fascinating illustrations. He began reading to her after dinner, choosing stories that captured her serious imagination. Ben was won over when Thomas carved him a set of wooden animals that perfectly matched the real ones on the ranch. The real turning point came during a thunderstorm in their second month together. Lightning had spooked the horses and Thomas rushed out to secure the barn despite the driving rain. Margaret watched through the window as he struggled to close the heavy barn doors alone, his weaker arm making the task more difficult in the wind and rain. Without thinking, she grabbed a coat and ran out to help him. Together they managed to get the door secured and the animals calmed. Afterward, standing in the barn dripping wet and breathing hard, they looked at each other and realized something had shifted. "We make a good team," Thomas said, and Margaret found herself smiling. "We do," she agreed. From that night forward, their partnership became real rather than just theoretical. Margaret began taking more initiative around the ranch, learning to milk the cow, gather eggs, and help with tasks that were easier with two people. Thomas included her in decisions about the cattle, asking for her opinions and listening to her suggestions. The children began to relax too. Lucy started calling Thomas Papa Tom without being prompted, and Ben began following him around the ranch, chattering constantly and asking endless questions about how everything worked. Thomas showed remarkable patience with Ben's curiosity, taking time to explain things carefully and letting the boy help with simple tasks. Margaret started to see glimpses of the man behind the careful correspondence. Thomas had a quiet sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable. He was surprisingly well-read and enjoyed discussing the books they shared in the evenings. He was gentle with animals in a way that spoke to deep kindness, and he was thoughtful about small things that made daily life easier. For his part, Thomas began to appreciate Margaret's practical intelligence and steady competence. She approached ranch life with determination and adaptability, figuring out solutions to problems without complaining. She was a good mother, firm but loving with her children, and she brought a warmth to the house that he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The moment when their arrangement truly became a partnership rather than just a mutual convenience came during a difficult calving in late spring. One of Thomas's best cows was having trouble delivering her calf, and it became clear that he would need help to save both mother and baby. Margaret sent the children to the house and worked alongside Thomas for hours, following his quiet instructions and providing the steady assistance he needed. By their first Christmas together, the McKinnon house had been transformed into something none of them had expected when Margaret and her children stepped off that train 6 months earlier. Red gingham curtains hung in the windows made from fabric Margaret had found at a good price in town. Ben's wooden toys were scattered across the living room floor, and Lucy's careful drawings decorated the walls. The smell of baking bread and Margaret's hearty cooking had replaced the bachelor simplicity that had defined Thomas's life for so many years. But the real transformation wasn't in the house's appearance. It was in the people who lived there. Thomas had discovered that Margaret's small, capable hands could accomplish tasks he'd struggled with for years. She could milk the cow twice as fast as he could, her fingers nimble and sure. She had a knack for organizing that made their shared work more efficient. When she suggested rearranging the barn to make feeding easier, Thomas was amazed at how much time and energy her simple changes saved them both. More importantly, Margaret had begun to share her opinions about ranch decisions without being asked. She'd studied his cattle with the same careful attention she'd once given to her vegetable garden, learning to spot signs of illness or injury that Thomas might miss when he was focused on other tasks. Her practical intelligence, combined with his experience, made them a formidable team. "You've got good instincts about livestock," Thomas told her one evening after she'd correctly identified a cow that needed medical attention. "Better than some men who've been ranching their whole lives." Margaret felt a flush of pride at his words. Patrick had rarely asked for her opinions about farm work, assuming that such decisions were men's business. Having her judgment valued and trusted was something entirely new. The children had settled into ranch life with the adaptability of youth, but it was more than just getting used to their new surroundings. Lucy had begun to relax in ways Margaret hadn't seen since before. Patrick's illness. She helped with cooking and cleaning, but she also had time to be a child again. Thomas had taught her to ride Daisy, the gentle mare, and she could often be found in the evenings reading by lamplight, working her way through books that challenged and excited her growing mind. Ben had attached himself to Thomas with the complete devotion of a boy hungry for a father figure. He followed Papa Tom everywhere, chattering constantly and absorbing everything the patient man was willing to teach him. Thomas showed him how to care for the animals, how to mend fences, how to read the weather signs that told them when storms were coming. "That boy's going to be a fine rancher someday," Thomas told Margaret, and she could hear the genuine affection in his voice. "He sees details most adults miss, and he's not afraid of hard work." The moment Margaret realized their arrangement had become something much deeper came during a harsh February storm. Snow had been falling for 2 days, and the wind was so fierce that traveling between the house and barn required a rope guide to keep from getting lost in the whiteout conditions. On the second night of the storm, they discovered that one of the horses had gotten tangled in a broken fence and was trapped in a dangerous position. Thomas would have to go out in the blizzard to free the animal before it injured itself further, but the conditions were treacherous, even for an experienced rancher. Margaret watched Thomas prepare for the rescue with growing anxiety. The storm was worse than anything she'd experienced, and the thought of him getting lost in the blinding snow filled her with a fear that surprised her with its intensity. "Be careful," she said, helping him into his heaviest coat. "I will," he promised, but they both knew how dangerous it was. Margaret spent the next hour pacing the kitchen, listening to the wind howl around the house and checking the clock every few minutes. Lucy and Ben had gone to bed, trusting that Papa Tom would handle whatever needed to be done. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible might happen. When Thomas finally returned, covered in snow and exhausted from fighting, the storm, Margaret felt relief wash over her so powerfully that she had to sit down. As he peeled off his wet clothes and warmed himself by the fire, she realized that somewhere along the way, her careful arrangement had become something much more personal. She cared about this quiet, steady man who had given her and her children a home. Not just because he provided security and partnership, but because he had become important to her in ways she hadn't expected. The thought of losing him had terrified her, and not just for practical reasons. Thomas, noticing her unusual quiet, asked if she was feeling all right. "I was worried about you out there," she admitted. "More worried than I expected to be." Something in her tone made Thomas look at her more carefully. In the firelight, her face showed a concern that went beyond practical partnership. For the first time since she'd arrived, Margaret was looking at him not as a business arrangement or a solution to her problems, but as a man she genuinely cared about. "I was careful," he said softly. "I had good reason to come back safely." Their eyes met across the warm kitchen, and both of them understood that something important had just been acknowledged between them. The spring brought new challenges and new opportunities for their growing partnership. Thomas had been planning to expand his herd, And with Margaret's help, he was able to take on projects that would have been impossible alone. She proved to have a good head for numbers, helping him calculate costs and profits in ways that made his decision-making more informed. When Thomas suggested they attend the church social in town, Margaret felt nervous about appearing in public as his wife. She'd been so focused on making their arrangement work that she hadn't thought much about how they would present themselves to the community. But the evening went better than she'd dared hope. The other ranch wives welcomed her warmly, and several commented on how much happier Thomas seemed since his marriage. Margaret watched him interact with his neighbors and realized that he was respected in the community in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. "Thomas McKinnon's got the best eye for cattle in 3 counties, she heard one man say. "And he's honest as the day is long. Lucky woman who got him for a husband." Margaret found herself feeling proud to be associated with this good man who had built his reputation on intelligence, integrity, and quiet competence. The moment when both of them realized their partnership had grown into love came during the spring roundup. Thomas had been working from dawn to dusk, gathering cattle for branding and health checks. Margaret had been helping wherever she could, managing the household, caring for the children, and providing the steady support that made his intensive work possible. On the final day of roundup, they were working together to separate a group of cattle when one of the younger bulls decided to challenge Thomas's authority. The animal charged, and in that split second, Margaret saw Thomas's life in danger. Without thinking, she grabbed a rope and threw herself between Thomas and the charging bull, shouting and waving her arms to distract the animal. Her quick thinking gave Thomas the chance to get to safety, but both of them were shaken by how close they'd come to disaster. Afterward, standing in the dust of the corral with adrenaline still coursing through their systems, they looked at each other and knew that everything had changed. "Why did you do that?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion. "You could have been killed." "Because I couldn't bear to lose you," Margaret said simply, and the honesty of it hung in the air between them. Thomas reached out with his good hand and gently touched her face. "Margaret," he said softly, "I think I love you." "I think I love you too," she replied, and both of them were surprised by how natural the words felt. That evening, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch and talked about their future in a way they never had before, not as business partners or practical companions, but as 2 people who had found something precious and unexpected in each other. "I never thought I'd have this," Thomas admitted. "I thought I'd spend my life alone, that no woman would want a man with my limitations." "Your limitations?" Margaret shook her head. "Thomas, you're the strongest man I've ever known. Maybe not in your arms, but in your character, your patience, your kindness. You've given me and my children more than I ever dared hope for." "You've given me a family," Thomas said. "A real family. Not just people sharing a house, but people who care about each other, who work together, who—" He paused, looking for the right words. "Who love each other." Their wedding had been a legal formality performed by the circuit judge 6 months earlier. But that night on the porch, they made promises to each other that went far deeper than any legal document. They pledged themselves not just as partners in a practical arrangement, but as companions who had chosen to build a life together based on love, respect, and shared dreams. Over the following months, their love deepened and matured in the way that comes from daily partnership and mutual support. They learned each other's rhythms, preferences, and dreams. Margaret discovered that Thomas had a wonderful singing voice that he'd never shared with anyone before. Thomas learned that Margaret had once dreamed of teaching and still loved learning new things. Together, they began planning projects that went beyond just surviving or even prospering. They talked about building a school for the scattered,